Okay, so this video is going to be 24/6 to 24/8, so we'll follow food from the mouth down through the stomach. You can tell there's a lot going on here as you're reading this chapter. Really encourage you, I'm trying to give you highlights here, but do pay attention. Like, I'm going to completely skip teeth. It's probably a good idea to know the names, if you don't already, of the different teeth. So things like that. There's a lot. This is a big chapter. Okay, so let's start here in the oral cavity, also called the buccal cavity. I know that's not what the spelling looks like, but it is the buccal cavity. And in the oral cavity, what we're looking at here are a few different things, right? This is where your sense of taste is. So we have a lot of sensory analysis of the food taking place. We, of course, also have some mechanical processing, the chewing of food, lubrication from the salivary glands, and the beginning of digestion. So we do get limited chemical digestion of food starting here, particularly only carbs and lipids. So there is a enzyme called salivary amylase, and that's going to begin the digestion of carbohydrates, salivary amylase. And then lingual lipase, lipase tells you that's what starts the digestion of lipids. Okay, so let's look at what we got here. So in the oral cavity, you can see a lot of the space is being taken up by the tongue. The tongue, of course, is where your sensory receptors are. The tongue is going to be important in helping move food around to ensure that chewing is taking place properly. And then you also do have some glands on the tongue, and that is where that lingual lipase that I just mentioned in fat digestion comes from, glands from the tongue. We also have multiple salivary glands. So saliva, you make about 1.5 liters of saliva a day, and it ends up being a mixture of things like your enzymes, so salivary amylase, mucins, which are basically mucus, right? So you're trying to make the food slippery to make it easier to swallow. You also, from your salivary glands, produce some lysozymes. These are enzymes that would be good at breaking down the cell walls of bacteria, so a little bit of protection there. And also in the saliva, there's some antibodies, right? So I think we're acknowledging that our mouth is the first point of contact with some of these microbes that might be in food, and so some protections there. So let's look at these glands. So this big one over here, kind of just anterior, inferior to the ear, has a duct that comes through, then it's kind of like by your second molar where that dumps in. And this gland primarily is producing salivary amylase. You also have there's the sublingual gland. So this one has a bunch of little ducts that come out along where your tongue is kind of attached to the bottom of your mouth, is called the lingual frenulum. And so all along that frenulum, there's little openings for the sublingual gland. I should say the parotid gland makes like 25% of your saliva. The sublingual gland here is only like 5%, so pretty small contribution, but it does a lot of the mucus secretion, so buffers, mucins, right, to lubricate the oral cavity and the food. The gland that produces the most of your saliva is actually the submandibular gland, right? So your mandible is your jawbone, and so it's kind of tucked up in under there, and you see the duct coming up towards the anterior edge of that lingual frenulum. That one you can probably actually see the opening for. Again, this gland is producing about 70% of your saliva, then buffers, mucins, salivary amylase, etc. Right? So it's making the whole shebang. Incidentally, do you remember? I could never gleek, at least not on purpose, but you know how like some people can actually like shoot saliva out from under their tongue? There you go, a little trivia. That's from the submandibular gland. Okay, other things here in the oral cavity, obviously the teeth are going to be really important in mechanical digestion. The technical term for chewing is mastication, which of course makes for lots of good jokes. That's the picture from the old book, picture from the old book. If you happen to like those better, feel free to take a peek. Okay, well, I do like this one for the view of the pharynx. So food in the oral cavity, it's getting chewed, it's getting pushed around by the tongue. And then when we do go to swallow, the food is going to enter the pharynx, right? So again, kind of the back of the throat, shared by the respiratory system. So then when we swallow food, it's going to go into the esophagus, and this is really just a hollow muscular tube connecting the pharynx down to the stomach. We do have, this picture's not going to show it, right above the right above the liver, remember, is the diaphragm, that dome-shaped muscle. You've seen that in dissection now. There's actually a small hole in the diaphragm to let the esophagus pass through, right, into the abdominopelvic cavity. And so that's called the esophageal hiatus. And the reason I point this one out is you can get a hiatal hernia, which would mean that part of the stomach is actually pushing up above the diaphragm, and then the sphincters aren't going to work right. It becomes problematic. So the esophageal hiatus is that little passageway through the diaphragm. And right around where it passes through the diaphragm, I guess just a little bit below that, right where the esophagus meets the stomach, is going to be the lower esophageal sphincter. And the idea of this sphincter, this band of muscle separating, right, determining the opening and closing of the esophagus into the stomach, is really to prevent backflow. So one of the things that we find, right, that we'll see here in a minute, is that there's lots of acid in the stomach and there's not here in the esophagus. And so if that sphincter isn't closing properly, you'll see folks with gastroesophageal reflux or GERD, and that brings a lot of acid back up into the esophagus. But the esophagus doesn't have the protections against that acid that the stomach does, right? The stomach actually has a lot of special glands producing mucus to protect the lining of the stomach. The esophagus doesn't have that. So that's why it's painful. And over time, that can actually lead to changes in the tissue. You'll actually go from being a stratified squamous epithelium, you get a metaplasia where you actually change the cell type into columnar cells, trying to protect the tissues. But that's also usually worrisome, because that can also indicate that we're moving towards the development of an esophageal cancer. So swallowing is a remarkably complex process that we never even think about. So this picture is probably way too small. You're going to need to look at this in the book if you want to follow along. But notice what we've got going on here, right? So this first phase, they're calling the voluntary phase, where you've chewed, you've kind of shaped this bolus of food, and then it doesn't have to be conscious, but it does require a voluntary signal from the brain, right, that now is time to swallow. And so really what you have going on is you have receptors on the palate, the roof of the mouth, and also the uvula, and those receptors are stimulated when the bolus touches there. That's going to get relayed to the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata does everything, apparently. And from there, we're going to set up a coordinated stereotyped pattern of contraction that is swallowing. It also, the medulla, since it's in charge of respiration too, when it can tell that a bolus of food is going to be swallowed, chooses to turn off or inhibit the respiratory centers that would be driving breathing. So it's actually a really neat coordinated process. And so here you can see the pharyngeal phase that's moving back into the pharynx. And again, we have contraction, sequential contraction of muscle along here to really push food down. Here's that point where the epiglottis, Carolina, here's that point where the epiglottis is really covering over that opening in the larynx, the glottis, the space in there, and the food is going to stay in the esophagus. right? Now we're in the esophageal phase, and we're basically seeing peristalsis, pushing the food down towards the stomach. And so that's an interesting one. I mean, definitely the stomach is inferior, and so gravity helps, but there is peristalsis in the esophagus to move that food along. Okay, the old book. So if you like this point of view, feel free. Okay, so now we're on to the stomach. So the stomach has quite a bit going on here as well. So it's going to do a few different things for us. It stores food until we're ready for it to move to the intestines for absorption. It does mechanical digestion with all the churning. It does a lot of the chemical digestion. We'll talk about the hydrochloric acids and the enzymes. And it produces a compound called intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is going to be important in the absorption of vitamin B12. And I know that seems like a random detail, but if this doesn't work, if you don't produce intrinsic factor and you don't absorb B12, you end up with a form of anemia called pernicious anemia. So there you go. Some of these details end up being really important in disease states. Okay, so not too much time on the anatomy, but just real quick, we have this region right where we enter from the esophagus called the cardia. It's also close to the heart, so that's probably why it got that name. The cardia, this little pooch that sticks upward here, is called the fundus. I suppose, that only fills up if you're having a lot of fun, right? Like eating a huge Thanksgiving dinner. So a little overflow parking there. We've got the body of the stomach, which is the majority of it. And then this most inferior portion right before we leave into the intestines is called the pylorus. Here you see the pyloric sphincter. That's going to be the band of muscle regulating the opening to the small intestine. Here they do show that the lower esophageal sphincter that I mentioned, preventing heartburn as well. Oh, and then lesser curvature, and I'm only pointing this out because remember when we were talking about the mesenteries, so we had the lesser omentum between the stomach and the lesser curvature of the stomach, and then we had the greater omentum hanging off this greater curvature. So we'll see those in lab. Again, we have the same, 4 different layers, right, as we get into the histology here. A couple things to point out. On the mucosal layer, right, so that's this inner one here, mucosal layer, we see all of these really obvious folds. Those are called rugae. This is going to help give room for the stomach to expand. In the muscularis layer, what I wanted to point out, and actually, mucosa. Yeah, in the muscularis layer, what I wanted to point out here is there's an extra layer of muscle. So instead of just circular longitudinal, now we also have an oblique. And this is also true in the muscularis mucosa. They're not showing it on here, but remember that mucosal layer does have a little bit of smooth muscle as well. And we have some extra here in the stomach. But this third layer, this oblique layer in the muscularis externa is important because now we're not just trying to propel food along a tube and need those 2 layers, but we're really trying to churn. And so that's where that third layer comes in handy. Okay, again, see, the old book shows that extra layer of muscle in the mucosa. Okay, so then histologically here. So what we'll see, and we will look at some of this histology in lab as well. Get out of your way here. Is that the cells lining the stomach are going to be simple columnar epithelium. And this simple columnar epithelium is responsible. Didn't make that look very columnar. There's a good one. These are going to be responsible for providing a layer of mucus along the surface of the stomach. So, yeah, so they have to produce that mucus to protect the stomach. You'll also find, right, and you can see the rugae in here, all those ridges. we get these what are called gastric pits. So we have like an opening here, a little neck, and then it dives down deep into that areolar connective tissue. We're still in the mucosa layer. Actually, this is nice. It lays that out, right? Mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and there's serosa. But we get these gastric pits. And so we've got a few different cell types that are lining these pits. I'm going to zoom in more. And so, again, the ones towards the surface are called mucus cells. They are producing the mucus. And then down in the pit, we have this connection to the gastric glands. The important cells here, parietal cells. So the parietal cells are the ones that produce the intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is just a glycoprotein, but it's going to help bind B12 and make it able to be absorbed. Parietal cells are also the cells that produce the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. We'll go to that in just a second. While I'm here, I did want to point out then chief cells. These are producing a protein, an inactive protein called pepsinogen. So pepsinogen produced by the chief cells is going to leave the gland, come out of the pit into the stomach, and when it is introduced to hydrochloric acid, it gets activated. So it goes from pepsinogen to pepsin, and pepsin is going to be really important in digesting proteins. Okay, how about that hydrochloric acid? Okay, here's our equation again. If the words help you, go back and look at this, but I'm just going to focus over here. So notice what happens in the parietal cells, right? Notice we're still in the parietal cell. We take carbon dioxide and water, and we use the same enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, to produce carbonic acid. Okay, so carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate. Notice bicarbonate is leaving the cell and going into the blood, and we're exchanging it for chloride. Isn't this wild? It's like the same thing. The chloride comes all the way through the cell, and the hydrogen also is moving into the gland, into the duct space, right? And so chloride and hydrogen come together to form HCl, hydrochloric acid. I just think that's so crazy. This hydrochloric acid, of course, is super important. We just mentioned that it's going to cleave pepsinogen into pepsin to allow us to digest proteins. The hydrochloric acid is going to be what helps break down cell walls so we can get to deeper portions of deeper portions of the cell. The hydrochloric acid breaks down connective tissues, right? So we can get food into smaller pieces. It denatures proteins, and it also kills microbes. So if you eat something that's a little funky, it really should, I'm not suggesting that you do, but the hydrochloric acid in your stomach should take care of it. Of course, there are some things that get past that. Same thing from a different book. So if you like this layout, carbon dioxide and water become carbonic acid, become bicarbonate and hydrogen. This one I like because it shows very clearly the hydrogen and the chloride coming together. Okay, but that's how we get hydrochloric acid in the stomach. It's the parietal cells that produce it. Okay, so then I guess we're to... Oh, I guess one other thing before we go there. Sorry. There are these G cells also in the gastric gland, and those produce gastrin, and this is a hormone. This gastrin is going to stimulate the chief cells and the parietal cells, and also stimulates contraction of the stomach wall. We'll also see there are other hormones that are going to be important. You might hear the hormone ghrelin. This is a hormone that tells you you're hungry. Again, remembering that previously we talked about the fact that along the GI tract there's a lot of these enteroendocrine cells, and so there are a lot of hormones that are going to be involved here. And we'll see some of that as we look at the regulation of gastric activity. So really, this comes in 3 different phases: the cephalic phase, the gastric phase, and the intestinal phase. So the cephalic phase begins before food even gets into the GI tract. It's basically preparing the stomach to receive food. So this would be, again, that hormone gastrin can get released and start stimulating parietal cells and sheath cells. And so what we're really seeing happen here is the sight, smell, just thinking about food is going to stimulate the central nervous system. And again, remember that most of this then is going to be coming through the parasympathetic nervous system, but it stimulates all of those cells to start increasing the amount of stomach acid that's being produced, right? And we see it kind of wrapping around here. It's going to start stimulating the churning. So you know how like your stomach growls sometimes when you're hungry? That's the cephalic phase. Okay. So we're basically preparing for that food to enter. And yay, right? In the gastric phase, all this like yellowish stuff is the chyme, the partially digested food that we just swallowed. See the fundus? It's just not, this was a good meal, but not a great meal. So here in the gastric phase, this is when food is actually arriving at the stomach. So when the food hits the stomach, it is causing distension. I'm in the way here, causing distension, stretching, and we have stretch receptors embedded in the wall of the stomach. And so that distension is going to communicate, right? So we see that that's communicating more release of stomach acid and also more churning, mixing of the food. The stretch also is going to cause the release of histamine, and histamine is going to be a localized response that again tells us to produce more stomach acid. Also in the gastric phase, so that's all just from stretching, right? But also in the gastric phase, we have chemoreceptors. And so things like an increase in pH, right? The pH was low with all the stomach acid, but then as you start dumping food in it, that is bringing you up closer to neutral, right? It's raising the pH. So things like the increase in pH, also even the presence of proteins, certain peptides, that's going to get picked up as these chemical signals. Again, what we're stimulating here is the mixing in the stomach. And then we move on to the intestinal phase. And this is going to be when we start opening that pyloric sphincter and letting chyme, I should call it chyme at this point, enter the small intestine. And so probably the most important thing that happens in this intestinal phase is that we control the rate at which food enters the small intestine. This is going to allow us to effectively run absorption from this chyme. And this is something people can have problems with, that emptying rate, and that'll affect their ability to absorb. So so you have what's called the enterogastric reflex. They're pointing this out here. And basically what this is as the duodenum, that's the first section of the small intestine, starts to stretch as it's receiving food, you actually have this reflex that comes back to the stomach and tells it to hold on. Like, give me a second, let me deal with this, right? And so that's a very short reflex here between the intestine and the stomach. And it also, that reflex does tell us to produce more mucus to help protect the duodenum. You'll also notice here the presence of certain foods in the small intestine is going to have a reaction here. So for example, cholecystokinin, that's is one that I talk about quite a bit. These have a feedback on the stomach as well, saying stop, right? Don't make more acid, don't make more pepsinogen, don't increase peristalsis, like give me a second here, right? And so we see those feedback by hormones as well. I also mentioned before cholecystokinin. They don't show it in here, but that's actually the hormone that triggers bile release. Bile is going to enter pretty early on here in the duodenum as well. Okay, so before we leave the stomach, I think my final thought on the stomach is keeping in mind what is going on here as far as digestion and absorption. So again, just big picture digestion. Really, the digestion that takes place in the stomach is going to be due to pepsin. So making pepsinogen, cleaving it to pepsin, and that's going to help us break down proteins into polypeptides. We do allow the lingual lipase and the salivary amylase to continue their digestion of lipids and carbs respectively in the stomach. But notice that's it really is. I know I guess hydrochloric acid is starting to denature proteins and things like that, but digestion, we think of the stomach as where digestion takes place, and notice we haven't really done a whole lot of that digestion. Most of that's going to take place in the small intestine. Also, the big goal of the GI tract is absorption, and it's really limited here at the stomach. Basically, things like alcohol can get absorbed across the stomach wall, so that's why it enters the bloodstream so quickly, and also some drugs, things like aspirin, are absorbed across the lining of the stomach. So, okay, there's the stomach. We'll see you in a few for the small intestine.